What would you do if your most highly trained canine partner suddenly stopped mid-mission, refused a direct order, just because he recognized an old name? On a stormy night in a quiet little town, what seemed like a routine chase opened the door to a past no one ever expected. A dog, a man, and a memory thought to be buried for 6 long years. If you believe there are bonds between humans and dogs that can never be broken, then Dog Stories is the channel for you. Subscribe now so you don't miss true, emotional, and unforgettable stories like this one. Now, join Dog Stories as we follow a tale that began with what looked like an ordinary moment, but changed everything. Rain poured down on the worn-out streets of Ashford Springs, as if trying to wash away the darkness itself. Streetlights blurred behind a thin layer of mist, and distant thunder echoed like a quiet warning that something was about to break. Officer Raymond Clark gripped the steering wheel slightly tighter, his eyes flicking between the road ahead and the flashing alert on the patrol car's dashboard. Alarm at Ashford Market. Possible break-in. Past midnight. No witnesses. No backup yet. Just him and Leo. The German Shepherd sat alert in the passenger seat, eyes locked forward, his body tense like a drawn bow. In 6 years on the force, Clark had never had a partner he trusted more than Leo. Absolute obedience. No hesitation. Always precise, like a machine. The radio crackled to life. Confirmed break-in. Movement detected behind the building. Suspect on the run. Clark flipped on the sirens. Red and blue lights flashed across the wet pavement like a live crime scene straight out of a movie. The car swerved sharply into a narrow alley. And then, he saw him. A shadow darted through the dark passage behind the convenience store. Visual, Clark muttered quickly, slamming the brakes. He swung the door open, hand instinctively resting on the holstered gun at his side. Leo, stay close. The dog leapt out immediately, claws skimming across the slick concrete before settling into a steady stride. The two, man and dog, moved as one. Breath, footsteps, and rain blending into a single rhythm. The suspect veered down a side path, sprinting straight into a dead end behind an old abandoned diner. Clark slowed his pace, drawing his gun but keeping it lowered. Leo moved ahead, ears perked, tail raised high. The man turned around, hands in the air, no weapon. Early 30s, maybe. Soaked to the bone, breathing hard, eyes wide, not with aggression, but fear. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked scared. Clark kept the barrel pointed down. Leo, he commanded calmly, eyes locked on the suspect. Attack. 1 second, 2. Nothing happened. The rain kept falling steadily. Then Leo stopped, not the kind of stop that waits for a cue. He froze, completely still. One ear twitched. His tail slowly dropped. Then Leo took a step back. He looked at Clark, then at the man, then back at Clark, confused, unsure. Clark frowned. Leo, move. Leo didn't budge. The man said something then, so soft it barely slipped through the sound of the rain. Leo? The name cut through the downpour. And Leo responded. His defensive stance melted away. His tail gave a small wag. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing like he recognized something, someone. Clark's chest tightened. What did you just say? He asked, taking a step forward. The man didn't answer Clark. His eyes stayed locked on Leo as if nothing else in the world existed but that dog. Leo, he said again, this time with trembling emotion. Is that you? And Leo, the top canine of the entire unit, let out a soft whine. No bark, no growl, no aggression, just a faint, shaky sound filled with feeling. Clark slowly lowered his weapon. The flashing lights lit up his face, revealing pure confusion. What the hell is going on? The man didn't move. He didn't run, didn't fight, didn't even speak. He just stood there, staring at Leo like he'd just seen a memory come back to life. Clark looked back at Leo, and for the first time in 6 years, he didn't see a police dog. He saw a soul remembering. The rain kept falling, steady and unrelenting, but in that moment in the dim alleyway, it felt like the entire world held its breath. Leo didn't attack. Instead of growling or charging like he had hundreds of times before, the canine stepped slowly toward the man with his hands in the air. His tail wagged gently. A faint whimper came from deep in his throat. Not a warning, but joy. Officer Raymond Clark kept his distance. His hand stayed on his weapon, but he no longer raised it. Every protocol for handling a break-in felt suspended by the strange behavior of the dog he once believed to be flawless. The man in front of him, soaked and shivering from the cold, didn't move. His eyes never left Leo, as if the rest of the world had vanished. His voice cracked. I didn't do anything wrong, I just saw my Leo. That sentence made Clark hesitate. My Leo? How could a suspect know a police dog's former name, and how could he be so sure? Clark didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward and cuffed the man by the book. There was no resistance, no argument. The man's eyes stayed fixed on Leo, filled with emotion and disbelief. Leo didn't look away either. He stood beside Clark, but his gaze remained locked on the man, unflinching. Back at the Ashford Springs station, the rain still hadn't let up. Cold fluorescent lights washed over the long hallway, reflecting off the water still clinging to boots and raincoats. Julian Hayes, the name on the ID, was placed in a holding cell. No shouting, no call for a lawyer. He just sat there, eyes distant, as if getting arrested didn't matter, only whether that dog was still nearby. Clark said nothing, but in his mind the questions were starting to pile up. Leo didn't just ignore the command, he willingly approached the suspect. For a K9, that wasn't just unusual, it was unheard of. Clark stepped into the observation room, staring through the one-way glass. Leo, rather than settling into his usual spot in the corner, was sitting right in front of the holding cell door, almost completely still. Those deep, dark eyes remained locked on Julian. This wasn't instinct, it wasn't training, it was emotion. Clark thought back to the day Leo joined the unit. The dog had been logged as found on the street, no known owner. The training process had gone so fast, he never questioned it. Leo had learned everything quickly, with almost unnatural discipline, like he'd already been taught before. And now Clark couldn't help but wonder, had we been wrong from the very beginning? He turned to a fellow officer and motioned for the K9 adoption file. His eyes scanned line by line. Something didn't add up. But before he could dig deeper, Leo, still sitting there, let out a soft whine, almost as if waiting for someone to open the door. From inside the cell, Julian looked up. His eyes were red. But for the first time since his arrest, he smiled, a faint, broken smile. He still remembers me, he whispered through the glass, more to himself than anyone else. 6 years, and he still remembers. Clark didn't move. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a criminal. This was two souls that had once lost each other, now reunited in the strangest rainstorm of their lives. And Leo was still there, sitting right in front of cell number 3, where Julian Hayes was being held. All night, he never left that spot. He didn't turn away. He didn't lie down. He just sat there, watching, like he was guarding a loved one who had finally returned after years apart. By morning, as the next shift of officers came in, a few of them began to notice the unusual behavior. "That dog's acting strange today," the desk sergeant murmured, eyeing Leo still in the exact same position since the shift change. "It's kinda eerie," another officer added. "It's like he's waiting for someone to open the door." In a station built on strict discipline and the predictable habits of well-trained K9s, Leo's decision to stand watch over a suspect, without command, without instruction, did not go unnoticed. Raymond Clark stood behind the observation glass, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. He watched them both, the dog and the man in the holding cell, like he was watching a play he hadn't meant to be a part of, yet somehow had become a supporting character in. Julian Hayes sat calmly, almost unbelievably composed. No panic, no anger, no impatience to be released. Every now and then, his eyes quietly drifted toward the glass, where Leo's gaze hadn't moved an inch. The two of them, it was like some invisible thread had tied them back together after all this time. Clark furrowed his brow. His mind began to drift backward. The first day Leo showed up at the K9 unit, he remembered it clearly. He'd been brought in from a stray dog rescue on the outskirts north of Ashford Springs. No one knew where he came from. No chip, no collar, no ID paperwork. There was only a single line in the file. Male, around 2 years old, found in healthy condition, shows signs of basic prior training. Leo learned fast, really fast. So fast that the K9 trainer once joked, "This one must have been a cop in a past life." At the time, Clark didn't think much of it. To him, a good dog was one that got the job done. And Leo was flawless, never broke protocol, never wavered, never let emotion interfere with duty, until last night. That moment was still burned into his memory like it had just happened. The dog refused to attack, not out of hesitation, but because he recognized something. And now, here, in the middle of the station, that behavior was still raising a question Clark didn't want to face. If Leo really is Julian's Leo, then everything I've believed for the past 6 years, was any of it ever true? He stepped out of the observation room and walked down the hallway toward where Leo was sitting. His footsteps echoed on the tiled floor, but the dog didn't turn around. Only when Clark got close did Leo glance up at him, just for a moment, then turned his eyes right back to Julian, as if to say, "You don't understand what this is." Clark crouched down, gently resting his hand on Leo's head. That familiar, solid feeling, just like every time before. But this time, something felt different. Silence hung in the air. From inside the cell, Julian spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "You know, he used to sleep right at my feet, every night, back when he was just a puppy." Clark looked up, their eyes met through the glass. No accusations, no apologies. There was only sadness, the kind that comes from something stolen long ago, finally starting to find its way back. Raymond Clark couldn't sleep. All night, the image of Leo sitting silently outside the holding cell played over and over in his mind like a reel stuck on loop, refusing to end. Early the next morning, while the Ashford Springs precinct was still quiet, Clark quietly stepped into the canine records room, a place lined with thick, dust-covered files like forgotten old books no one ever touched. He knew exactly what he was looking for: Leo's intake file. The cover was simple: Canine Unit, Leo ID K9117, stamped with the official date he was brought onto the force. But the moment Clark flipped to the first page, he froze. The intake date read 10/3. The rest was blurred out with a scratch mark, and next to it, a different number had been handwritten in. The ink was a different color. The font didn't match. It had clearly been altered. Clark frowned. It was a small detail, but one that couldn't be ignored. In law enforcement records, every entry was typed, formal, and official. Handwritten edits, they didn't happen, ever. He flipped through the next few pages. No record of who found the dog, no specific location, no intake photo, no supporting documents. All the file held was a few vague lines. Male dog, approximately 2 years old. No microchip, no collar. Found wandering near the West Residential Zone. Healthy. Shows signs of basic training response. Stray? Clark repeated silently. He remembered clearly the first time he met Leo, a dog that wasn't afraid of people, that reacted to commands instantly, that walked in line, didn't jump, didn't panic like the strays he'd seen before. Leo knew what to do, as if he'd already been taught. Clark leaned back against the filing shelf, the file still in his hands. A strange feeling crept into his chest. Something wasn't right. A discarded dog doesn't move with that kind of control. Doesn't follow orders on the first try, doesn't stay calm like a soldier in the middle of blaring sirens, yelling and chaos. He thought back to those early training sessions. Leo never had to be taught how to respond to commands, he just needed to hear the right word. As if he had lived a different life before. A life of discipline, a life of love, and then had disappeared. His eyes returned to the last line on the intake form. Temporarily classified as stray, fast-tracked for supplemental training. Temporarily classified? Clark repeated aloud. Why temporary? He set the file down on the desk, pulled up his computer, and searched the intake records for canine dogs that year. Leo was the only case with no intake photo. No medical records from the department's partner vet. No original behavior assessment from any rescue facility, because no shelter had ever reported receiving this dog. Clark reversed his approach. What if he searched for any missing dog reports from around Ashford Springs 6 years ago? No exact matches yet. But one detail stood out, something he couldn't ignore. The date Leo was logged as found, summer of 2019. Exactly the same time Julian Hayes said his dog, Leo, vanished from his backyard while playing alone. Clark stood up. He needed to dig deeper. He had to find out who first brought Leo into the department. But every trail led to one single name, signed at the bottom of the intake form: C. Denton. Lieutenant Charles Denton. The officer in charge of the K9 unit. The man who had personally overseen every K9 intake for the past 10 years. Clark stared at the paper, then looked down the hallway, where Leo still lay beside the holding cell, like a loyal shadow refusing to leave. And in that moment, a thought crept in, uninvited, but impossible to shake. Maybe Leo was never a dog without a past. Maybe someone just went out of their way to erase it. That morning, the skies over Ashford Springs were still heavy with clouds, as if the night hadn't fully ended. The air inside the police station felt thicker than usual. Then, just as Clark was scanning through more canine files, a soft knock came from the hallway. A young officer peeked in, his voice low. "There's an older woman. Says she wants to speak with whoever's handling last night's case." Clark stepped out. In front of him stood an elderly woman, thin, upright, her raincoat still soaked. Behind thick glasses were sharp, steady eyes that looked like they'd seen more than they let on. "I'm Edith Morgan," she said, gentle but firm. "I live across the street from the convenience store, second floor, and I saw everything last night from my window." Clark invited her into the interview room. There was no need for coaxing. Edith sat down and began to speak, as if she'd been carrying this story for hours, just waiting for the right person to hear it. "I heard the alarm go off, like usual. But when I looked down, I saw a man, not running away but helping someone. An old homeless man who always sits on that corner. I saw it clearly. That young man took off his coat, wrapped it around the old man, and tried to pull him somewhere out of the rain." Clark looked at her, unable to hide his surprise. "You're sure? You saw that clearly?" "Clear as day. My eyes might be nearsighted, but I know what I see. People think just because I'm old my memory's gone, but I remember every corner of this neighborhood like the back of my hand." Edith paused, like she was weighing something. Then she continued, "And there's one more thing I can't forget. The dog." Clark leaned in slightly. The story had just taken a turn he didn't see coming. "Dog?" "Yes. The one that was with the officer last night. I saw him, and I'm certain I saw that same dog 6 years ago when he was just a pup." The air in the room grew still. Clark didn't interrupt. He let her go on. "He used to play in the yard across from my window back then. A young man raised him, loved him dearly. That dog's name was Leo. I remember because he had a tiny white patch just behind his left ear. Very distinct." Clark felt his heart skip. Leo, the white mark behind the ear, the young man, 6 years ago. The puzzle pieces Clark had been turning over in files and reports were now being confirmed, vividly and unexpectedly, by a witness completely outside the system. "He used to walk Leo every afternoon," Edith continued, her voice slow, like she was watching it all unfold again in her memory. "Then one day I stopped seeing the dog. I figured he'd run off. But that boy, Julian. I saw him putting up flyers, going door to door asking about him. He didn't seem like the kind of person who'd just abandon a pet." Clark sat in silence. The cold knot in his chest began to loosen, replaced by something harder to define. Doubt was slowly turning into belief. He glanced through the glass out into the hallway. Leo was still lying there, just outside Julian Hayes's cell, those unwavering, loyal eyes never once leaving the door. And now Clark understood. Maybe the dog had seen the truth from the beginning. It just took the humans longer to catch up. After meeting with Edith Morgan, something inside Officer Raymond Clark had shifted. He was no longer doubting the case out of duty. He was doubting it because his heart was telling him a truth had been buried for far too long. By noon, Clark stepped into the holding room where Julian Hayes sat, as quiet as he had been since the arrest. No complaints, no questions. No request for a phone call. He seemed like someone used to silence, or someone holding on to something deeper than any defense could explain. Clark pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "Tell me about Leo," he said, no small talk, no preamble. Julian looked him in the eye, maybe a little surprised by the bluntness. There was a brief pause, then his voice lowered, like every word was being pulled from a memory soaked in loss. "I adopted him when he was just a few weeks old. A friend of my mom's had a litter, and I picked Leo out of all of them. He wasn't the biggest or the most playful, but he looked at me like he chose me first." Clark said nothing, just gave a small nod. Julian went on. "Leo was weirdly smart. I didn't have to train him much. He picked things up fast. I taught him to sit with a whistle, spin in a circle with a hand motion, and shake hands when I said, 'Big bro.' Sounds silly, right? But he remembered every bit of it. He'd even pretend to drop dead if I tapped my chest 3 times. Clark raised an eyebrow. Those commands didn't resemble anything in the official canine training manuals. Julian gave a faint smile. "The last time I saw him was before I left for night classes. I remember it clearly. It was late afternoon. The sun had just come out again after a rain. My mom was home. Leo was playing in the backyard. The gate was locked, no strangers around. When my mom went out to check on him a few minutes later, he was gone. I searched for him for over a month, posted online, printed flyers, went to every rescue center I could find, but no one had seen a dog like him. My mom told me I had to accept it. But I knew Leo didn't run away on his own. Silence settled again, but this time Clark didn't let it linger. He stood up and left the room, but didn't go far. He returned with Leo. The dog entered on Clark's command, but immediately locked eyes on Julian. There was no hesitation, just like every other time these past few days. "You said he responds to a whistle?" Clark asked. Julian nodded slightly, then gave a short, soft whistle. Leo sat clean, fast, with the kind of muscle memory that didn't need thinking. Clark stayed quiet, but something shifted in his eyes. Julian raised his hand and drew a small circle in the air. Leo stood up and spun in a full circle, his tail wagging gently like he was remembering an old game. And then, "Big bro," Julian said. Leo lifted his paw and placed it in Julian's hand like it was something he'd done 100 times before, long ago. Nothing more needed to be said. No paperwork, no microchip. Clark stood frozen, a part of him unable to believe what he was seeing. No K9 in the unit was ever trained that way. That wasn't a police technique. That was a memory. Leo wasn't just reacting, he was remembering. And not just remembering a person. He was remembering his person. The one who called his name every day, who held him at night, who taught him silly little games only the two of them understood. Clark stepped out into the hallway. Leo didn't follow. He stayed with Julian, sat down in front of the holding cell. Quiet, steady, like a loyal sentry guarding the one thing he loved most. A passing officer frowned. "That dog still hasn't moved?" Clark answered softly, eyes still on Leo. "No, and I think he knows exactly why." For the first time in his entire career, Raymond Clark started to believe this. Some bonds can't be broken by time or training. Some things can't be taught, only remembered by the heart. And quietly, a question flickered to life inside him. Had Leo come home? Leo lay silently in front of the cell door, just like always. Inside, Julian gently reached up and placed his hand on the glass. No words were spoken, but in that moment, Clark knew. They were connected by something deeper than language. That afternoon, Clark returned to see Julian once more. He didn't bring questions, no paperwork, just a feeling that something still hadn't been said. Julian looked up as Clark entered, gave a small nod. "You want to know exactly what happened the night he disappeared, don't you?" Clark sat down, quietly motioning for him to go on. "Leo was 8 months old then. Still young but smarter than any dog I'd ever seen," Julian said quietly. "That night, I had an evening class. My mom was home. Leo was playing in the backyard, just like always." He paused for a moment, his voice dipping lower. "The gate was locked. We always kept it locked. No one came over, no doorbell, no strange noise. But when my mom went outside, just a few minutes later, Leo was gone." Clark nodded slowly, not interrupting. Julian went on. "There were no broken locks, no holes dug. That yard's fenced in from all 4 sides. You know how houses around here are built. We searched the whole neighborhood, posted flyers, even reported it to the police, but no one ever found a thing." Clark jotted down every word. And then, one detail in that story stopped him cold. "Even reported it to the police." He stood up. "Do you remember the name of the officer who filed the missing dog report?" Clark asked. Julian shook his head. "No. My mom dealt with the police. All I know is they said they'd look into it, and then we never heard anything again." Clark left the holding cell, his heart starting to pound, though he couldn't quite say why. This time, he didn't search the database using the dog's name. He searched by address. Julian's home. Matching the time frame both he and Edith Morgan had mentioned. Summer, 6 years ago. A thin case file was pulled from the archive. The first page read, "Case type, missing pet report. Reporting party, Linda Hayes. Location 1274 Elmwood Street. Description, male dog, dark brown coat, name Leo. Went missing from fenced backyard. Gate locked. No signs of escape." Date filed, June 19th. Filed by C. Denton. Clark stared at the signature. C. Denton, Lieutenant Charles Denton, head of the K9 unit, and the same man who had handled every adoption file, including Leo's. His chest tightened as he compared the signature on the missing pet report to the one on Leo's K9 intake file. Same pen stroke, same slant, identical handwriting. Clark dug deeper into the unit's records. The officer listed as the one who officially processed Leo into the K9 program. The person who approved the intake, signed off on his health check, and recommended him for accelerated training was also Denton. Every document had gone through him. Clark stared at the line in the file. No known owner, stray. But 6 weeks earlier, Denton himself had filed a report for a missing dog. Now, a supposedly stray, unclaimed dog had magically appeared, processed into the K9 unit without a photo, without a certified vet report, and without confirmation from any rescue shelter. Clark's voice was barely above a whisper. You erased his past and made him yours. A chill ran down Clark's spine. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Leo had vanished without a trace. A report was quietly filed, then quietly forgotten. And weeks later, a dog that looked exactly like him showed up in the K9 unit. Clean record, no past, no questions asked. And the man who tied it all together, Charles Denton, had made sure everything stayed buried. Clark rose to his feet. This was no longer about a dog. It was about a truth that had been stolen. And the deeper Officer Raymond Clark dug, the more he realized something was rotting beneath the very place he had trusted for years. The name Charles Denton was no longer just a signature at the bottom of a report. It was showing up far too often in all the wrong places, tied to too many K9 intake cases with vague origins and missing documentation. Clark knew he had to dig deeper. Quietly. He didn't want to raise suspicion, at least not until he was sure. For the next 3 days, he combed through every K9 unit intake record from the past 6 years, focusing on the dogs labeled as strays, lost, or surrendered by civilians, with no official paperwork from any animal welfare agency. What he found chilled him to the bone. 8 cases, all signed and approved by Charles Denton. 5 of them showed clear signs of manual alteration, just like Leo's file, with handwritten dates scribbled over faded printed ones. Some forms left the found by field completely blank, yet were still processed and approved. Worse, in the department's digital records, Clark discovered something even more troubling. Initial intake photos of several dogs had been uploaded, only to be deleted later and replaced with post-training images. Every sign pointed to the same pattern. Someone had deliberately erased any trace of these dogs' pasts before they became part of the K9 unit. Clark followed a new lead. A storage facility registered under the name of a third-party K9 training contractor. The company had once held a short-term contract with the department, but had quietly gone out of business. He hired an IT technician to help check the warehouse rental invoices. The quarterly payments were made by C. Denton. With secret support from a former logistics staff member, Clark quietly accessed the storage unit over the weekend. Inside were dusty wooden shelves filled with plastic bins labeled training equipment. No official documents, no tracking logs, but in one corner of the shelf, beneath old leashes, Clark found a small box containing metal dog tags, many worn out, some rusted. He flipped through them one by one. By the 5th tag, his heart nearly stopped. Engraved into the cold metal were the words, Leo, 1274 Elmwood Site. Julian Hayes's home address. Clark gripped the tag tightly, as if holding the stolen past of an innocent soul in his hands. Back at the station, Clark dove deeper, this time into the duty logs from the night of the convenience store break-in, the same night Leo unexpectedly recognized his former owner. He requested the tech department to pull surveillance footage from around the area, archived in the City Hall's data system. At exactly 9:42 p.m., just minutes before the alarm was triggered, a pickup truck was seen parking in a narrow alley behind the store. The image was grainy, but the license plate was clearly visible thanks to infrared filters. The registered owner? Charles Denton. The truck had left before the patrol unit arrived at the scene. There was no reason for Denton to be there, especially off-duty, with no assignment in that area. The next afternoon, Clark walked into Lieutenant Denton's office. The door was slightly ajar, the air inside a mix of bitter coffee and old cigarette smoke. Denton looked up, his familiar calm expression in place. "Something on your mind, Clark?" Clark placed a stack of documents on the desk, printed copies of altered records, stills from the surveillance footage, and finally, a small dog tag sealed in a clear Ziploc bag. "You knew that dog wasn't a stray, and you signed the papers anyway." There was no immediate reaction, just silence. heavy and unmoving. Denton leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on Clark. "You don't understand the whole picture," he said, voice low, almost distant. "There are things you'd be better off leaving alone. I know enough to tell who's lying, and I won't stay quiet when a dog is taken from his family just to serve what you call operational efficiency." For the first time, Clark saw a flicker of hesitation in Denton's eyes, small but real, and he knew the curtain was about to fall. Right after that tense conversation in the office, Clark expected Denton to start covering his tracks. But no. Just a few hours later, Denton made his move, heading straight to the holding area where Julian Hayes was still being detained for questioning. Clark was in the duty room, finishing up a report, when he heard heavy footsteps pounding down the hallway. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Clark?" Denton barked, storming in more furious than Clark had ever seen him. Clark calmly stood up, but before he could say a word, Denton slammed a folder onto the desk. "Who do you think you are? The chief? You broke into a storage unit, pulled security footage without clearance, and interrogated your superior in his own office? All this over a dog?" "It's not just a dog," Clark replied slowly. "It's a life that was stolen, and you know that." The words hit Denton like a slap. He stepped forward, pointing a finger at Clark. "You're digging the grave of your own damn career, you know that? I've been doing this for 20 years. I built the K9 unit from the ground up, and I will not be taken down by a mutt and some homeless kid." Clark didn't respond. He just stood there, eyes locked on Denton, like he was waiting for the man to run out of steam all on his own. But something even more unexpected happened right after. Denton, whether from losing control or something else entirely, spun around and marched straight toward the holding cell where Julian was being kept, with Leo still lying guard outside the door. Clark immediately followed, and just as Denton reached out, hand moving toward the lock, Leo jumped up. No barking, no growling, but his eyes were razor sharp, his body taut with protective instinct, and most of all, he stood squarely between Denton and Julian. The silence in that moment was heavier than any of the shouting before it. Denton froze mid-step. His eyes flickered with something between disbelief and hesitation. "Move," he growled. Leo didn't budge. Clark stood behind them. No gun drawn, no words spoken. He didn't need to step in. Leo had already made his choice. At the end of the hallway, a duty officer had been watching the entire scene unfold, and above them, mounted discreetly on the ceiling, was a new surveillance camera, installed just weeks ago, recording every second. It caught everything. A high-ranking officer attempting to approach a detainee without authorization, and a trained K9 unit refusing to obey that officer's order, standing guard instead. Denton, now seeming to realize the gravity of the moment, slowly turned to Clark, eyes narrowing. "You set this up, didn't you?" he hissed. "You're trying to drag me down into the mess you've made." Clark didn't argue. He simply replied, "I didn't have to set anything up. You walked straight into it yourself." A few hours later, while tension still hung thick in the air at the precinct, a woman appeared at the front desk. It was Edith Morgan, holding a large envelope in one hand. Her face showed traces of worry, but her eyes were steady and resolute. "I found this," she said, "from some old photos I took from my window about 6 years ago." Clark invited her into the conference room. Edith opened the envelope and pulled out a slightly faded photo printed on matte paper. But under the harsh overhead light, the image was clear. A man in a police uniform, pulling a dog out from behind the gate of the house at 1274 Elmwood Street. The man was Charles Denton. The photo was taken from an angle, but clear enough to identify him. The dog was struggling, its leash pulled taut, and in the distance, framed by a window, the silhouette of a woman could be seen, most likely Julian's mother. Clark snapped a picture with his phone and sent it to the tech department for verification. It didn't take long. The address matched, the date matched, the uniform matched, and the person in the photo, 100% confirmed to be Denton. Clark immediately submitted the evidence to his superiors. With everything on file, the altered documents, surveillance footage, Denton's intimidation of Julian, Leo's defensive behavior, and now Edith's photograph, a suspension order was issued that very afternoon. Denton was required to surrender his badge, his service weapon, and all internal access privileges. And just days later, the district attorney's office filed formal charges: abuse of authority, falsifying official records, and unlawful seizure of personal property. At the station, Leo, or more accurately, Julian's Leo, was still lying in front of the holding cell, but this time in a different posture. His body was more relaxed, his eyes calmer, as if he knew the truth had finally come to light. A few days after Denton was officially suspended and charged, the Ashford Springs Police Department entered a chapter it had never seen before. All eyes were no longer on the fallen officer of authority, but on a dog. Leo was officially confirmed not to be a stray. He was a missing pet, reported lost 6 years ago, wrongfully entered into the K-9 unit with forged paperwork. But what truly surprised everyone was that Leo had become one of the top-performing K-9 officers in the entire state. Through sheer instinct and unshakable spirit, he had served with everything he had, never knowing he'd been taken from the only home he ever knew. Given the extraordinary circumstances, Julian Hayes, despite being cleared of wrongdoing and reunited with his long-lost friend, didn't demand that Leo be removed from the force. A closed-door meeting was held with the police chief, Raymond Clark, the K-9 unit leadership, and Julian's legal representative. The room was heavy with silence. Julian said just one thing: "I just want to see him, care for him. Know that he's still happy. He used to be my family. Now he's the city's hero. We don't need to choose. We can share him." And so, an unprecedented decision was made. Leo would now serve on a rotating schedule: 3 days with the K-9 unit, 4 days at home with Julian, 1 week of duty, 1 week of rest. All medical, nutrition, and care costs would be split, half covered by the city's fund and the other half by Julian and community donations. The story quickly spread beyond Ashford Springs. The media called it the story of 2 names, 1 heart. A national news segment opened with a shot of Leo sitting between 2 men, Officer Clark on one side, Julian on the other, both family in different ways. Social media exploded with posts, comments, and fan art. A short clip of Leo shaking hands with Julian using his old cue, then snapping to attention at Clark's command, went viral, racking up millions of views. One comment stood out among thousands: "We need more people like Clark and more dogs like Leo who know how to choose what's right without being told." Edith Morgan, the quiet but pivotal witness, was honored by the local government for watching over and protecting the truth for 6 years. She still sat by her window every day, but now, whenever Leo visited Julian's home, she waved at him, like greeting a family member who had finally come home. One late afternoon, the sun finally broke through the skies of Ashford Springs after days of endless rain. The backyard behind Julian's house glowed in warm golden light. Leo lay by the porch, his head resting gently on Julian's leg. The man sat in silence, fingers stroking the thick fur, eyes gazing out at the open sky ahead. There were no sirens, no commands, just sunlight, a soft breeze, and the steady breathing of a heart that never forgot. Clark sat quietly on a stone bench nearby, a cup of coffee long gone cold in his hands. He watched the scene and for the first time in a long while felt something close to peace. No one needed to speak. Nothing else was needed. Everything and everyone was exactly where they belonged. And then, over gentle music, Charlie's warm voice rose, bringing the story to a close. Some bonds never break. Some hearts never forget. There are reunions that need no promises. There are hearts that don't need a reason to remember. And there are dogs, like Leo, who will always choose the path that leads back to where love once began. Leo's story isn't just about finding an old friend. It's a reminder that loyalty has no expiration date, love doesn't need paperwork, and the truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way home. If you believe, like we do, that the invisible bond between humans and dogs is one of life's greatest miracles, support Dog Stories by subscribing to our channel. Every click helps powerful stories like this reach more hearts. And now we want to hear from you. What did you think about Leo's ending? What would you do if your 4-legged best friend was taken from you for 6 long years? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. See you in the next story. Who knows? It might just be another unfinished piece, waiting to be found.